I knew everything. Every detail, every lie, every forbidden touch. They were together now, at his house. She thought I would never find out, that her banal excuses and deleted messages would be enough to hide the betrayal. But they weren't. I had seen everything. It was at that moment, with a heavy heart, that I decided to put an end to it once and for all. I picked up my cell phone, and the message came out almost effortlessly: I know everything. I want a divorce. I will expose your betrayal. I pressed send. There was no hesitation. The button press brought with it years of shattered trust, wasted love, and now, a cold desire for revenge. I imagined her expression when she read it. I imagined the shock freezing his words, the devastating silence that would take over that room. Why did she do this? I asked myself countless times. At that moment, at her lover's house, she would understand that the game was over. Every step she took to get to that man, every word she hid from me, all of this now had a consequence. I knew this message would hit her like a punch in the stomach, knocking the air out. Because, until then, she had control of the situation. Until then, she believed I was the idiot who would never find out. And predictably, the phone began to vibrate incessantly, dozens of calls ignored. I knew she would try to look for me, make excuses, desperate to explain the inexplicable. I didn't answer. I let her feel the weight of my silence, a silence that spoke more than any words could. The silence of someone who had been deceived, betrayed in such a brutal way that all memories of good times were poisoned, stained. I remembered all the times I looked into her eyes, believing the lies she told me. I remembered the nights when I waited for her to get home, the smell of different perfume, the forced smile, the lame excuses about work or dinners with friends. Everything made sense now. All the pieces that didn't fit were there, forming a painful but undeniable truth: she was sleeping with another man. And I had allowed it, blinded by trust, by hope that we were okay. But now, there was no turning back. And the cruelest thing was that, somehow, I still loved her. Or loved the version of her that existed before everything fell apart. What was left now? What would be left of me after this betrayal was exposed? I didn't know. I just knew that it needed to end, that I could no longer be a prisoner of that lie. How did you find out? It was the first message she sent after hours. And that was the moment I realized how deep his guilt was. She didn't deny it. He didn't apologize immediately. Her first reaction was to try to understand how I knew, how her secrets escaped the safe place she believed she had built. It hit me like a new stab. She was more concerned about the exposure than the damage it caused to our relationship. My breathing became heavy. I could feel the anger boiling, but beneath it was something stronger, a devastating sadness. She never thought about me, about how I would feel when I found out. For her, I was just the obstacle, the weight she needed to carry while she lived her adventure with her lover. How many times did they laugh at me? How many times have they seen me as the naive husband waiting at home while they shared hidden smiles and touches? What she didn't know was that I was prepared. This betrayal would not be without consequences. I had planned everything. Not just divorce, but something deeper. I was going to take her away from everything she thought she had control over. She didn't know that while she was cheating, I was preparing to fight back in ways she would never have imagined. I had consulted lawyers, transferred assets, emptied joint accounts. The life of luxury she thought she shared with me was about to fall apart. From the moment she decided to leave our bed and go to another man's bed, she lost everything. I remembered our first years together. There was love there, true passion. Or at least, that's what I believed. In the beginning, we built dreams, plans for a long, safe life, alongside each other. But those dreams now seemed distant, almost unreal. She was no longer the woman I fell in love with. Or maybe, she never was. Maybe this version of her, this woman who cheats and lies without remorse, was always there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. As the clock ticked down into that endless night, I felt the weight of the decision. Expose everything or not? Make her pay publicly for what she did. Part of me wanted everyone to know, for his name to be destroyed along with our relationship. But another part wondered, what then? What would I gain from this? Would her humiliation make up for the pain I was feeling? Thoughts raced, but the fact was undeniable: the betrayal had occurred, and nothing she said would change that. I knew she would try to turn things around, try to make me believe it was a mistake, that she still loved me, that we could start over. But the truth is, once trust is broken, there is no going back. And I could never trust her again. She still didn't know how deep I was willing to go. I wasn't the passive man she imagined. And that was the irony. While she saw me as the naive husband, I was becoming the architect of her downfall. And I wouldn't have to lift a finger for that. The law was on my side. Finances too. The moment the divorce was signed, she would understand that she had lost everything. Not just me, but also the comfortable life I cherished so much. In that house, at that moment, she still didn't know what awaited her. Her lover might have been there beside her, trying to comfort her. Perhaps they were silent, with the weight of my message echoing among them. But I didn't care. From now on, it was every man for himself. And as the sun began to rise, I knew this was just the first of many sleepless nights for her. She had no idea what was coming. I, on the other hand, was sure that when it was all over, she would understand what it was like to lose. What she didn't expect was the full impact of the betrayal on her life, and what it would leave her with. The morning started peacefully, like so many others. Thomas got up early, as he did every day, to prepare breakfast. The sun was still rising over the horizon, and the first rays of light streamed through the windows of the large house he shared with his wife, Laura. The kitchen was spacious and well equipped, with polished marble and white, modern cabinets. The life they had built there, in that house, seemed solid, unshakable. They were the couple that everyone admired, their friends envied the harmony that seemed to reign in their relationship. In the eyes of the world, everything was perfect. Thomas liked to think he knew Laura like no one else. They had been together for more than a decade, since their college days, where he had met her during a lecture on literature. She, with her bright smile and always attentive eyes, had captivated his attention from the first moment. He was a simple man, focused on his career as an engineer, while she dedicated herself to her passion for the fine arts, exhibiting her works in small galleries and local events. They formed a perfect balance. He was methodical, practical, while she had a freer, more creative spirit. Over the years, their love had evolved. The sparks at the beginning of their relationship, which were previously fueled by passion and youth, turned into a deep complicity, something that Thomas valued above all else. He liked to think that, even after so much time, he could still surprise Laura with small gestures of affection, like the flowers he left in her study or the nights he prepared special dinners for them. Laura, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distant. Although she still showed affection and was caring, there was something about her that had changed. Maybe it was time, maybe it was the frustrations of an artistic career that hadn't taken off as she imagined. His eyes, which had once sparkled with enthusiasm, now seemed to reflect a deep weariness. She spent long hours in the studio, immersed in her canvases and brushes, but the results seemed less satisfactory to her with each passing day. Thomas noticed these changes, but preferred not to talk about them. He believed it was a phase, something that would soon pass, like so many other difficulties they faced together. He was convinced that his connection with Laura was strong enough to withstand life's ups and downs. After all, they had already overcome so much. However, a slight uneasiness was beginning to settle in the back of his mind. Laura's small attitudes that he would previously have ignored now aroused in him a subtle, but growing, distrust. She had started spending more time outside the house. There was always a new exhibition to visit, a meeting with artists or a last-minute meeting. At first, Thomas didn't care. Laura had always been an independent woman, with her own circle of friends and interests. He liked this side of her, this ability to seek new experiences, while he, more of a homebody, preferred to spend his free time at home. However, Laura's excuses became more frequent, and the nights in which she arrived late, without very clear explanations, began to multiply. Despite feeling like something was different, Thomas clung to the idea that they were still okay. He preferred to ignore the signs, believing that Laura was just stressed about her projects and that everything would soon return to normal. On weekends, he insisted on planning activities for the two of them, such as picnics, dinners out, or short trips. She, however, often refused, citing tiredness or last-minute commitments. On calmer days, they still managed to laugh together. Thomas was skilled at turning any ordinary situation into a light-hearted moment, and Laura always laughed at his silly jokes, even if just out of habit. Those moments still made him believe that everything was under control, that the flame of the relationship, even though it was soft, still burned. At home, Laura kept up appearances. I kissed him in the morning, exchanged affectionate messages during the day and, sometimes, even talked about new plans for the future, such as renovating the studio or planning a trip for next summer. Thomas clung to these signs as if they were proof that, despite the turbulent times, they were on the right path. However, there were nights when Laura seemed more distant than ever. Sitting on the sofa, with a book open on her lap, she looked out the window as if she were somewhere else. When Thomas called her, she took a few seconds to respond, as if she had returned from a distant trip. At these times, he wondered what was really going through her head. What was she hiding? Their relationship, which was once an unbreakable partnership, began to show signs of wear and tear, but in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. There were no fights, screams, or arguments. It was a kind of silent erosion, a gradual withdrawal that seemed to have no specific cause, but which, at the same time, was always present. For Thomas, the worst thing was not the silence, but the feeling that he was losing control of his life. Despite everything, he still held out hope that things would get better. After all, Laura was still his companion, and he refused to believe that something more serious was happening. There was so much at stake, so many memories, so many promises made to each other. For Thomas, their love was still there, just waiting for the right time to blossom again. He remembered the days when the simple touch of Laura's hands was enough to calm any storm in his mind. Now, however, her touches were colder, more distant, as if she were only there out of obligation. Thomas felt this, but he fought these thoughts, believing they were nothing more than paranoia. After all, Laura had always been like this, reserved, introspective. He knew she carried the world on her shoulders, and he was willing to be the foundation she needed. As the days passed, the distance between them seemed to increase. What were once shared moments now became uncomfortable silences. Thomas made a point of maintaining routines, such as preparing dinner and watching movies together, but increasingly, Laura found excuses to be away. The studio, her friends, last-minute meetings, there was always something that kept her from being with him. Still, Thomas persisted. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was love. Or maybe he just wasn't ready to face the truth that, deep down, was beginning to emerge more clearly every day. Thomas's days became a constant struggle to maintain normalcy. He would wake up, go about his work routine, prepare dinner and wait for Laura, but the feeling of restlessness, which had previously been a discreet shadow, now hovered over his every thought. He avoided facing the truth that was beginning to form in his mind, that uncomfortable idea that he didn't want to accept, something was deeply wrong between them. Laura continued to be frequently absent. She left earlier and returned later and later, always with excuses ready, meetings, dinners with artist friends, last-minute events. There was a layer of superficiality to his words, a slight hesitation in his eyes, but Thomas, true to his optimistic nature, ignored the signs. I preferred to believe it was just a turbulent period. Long marriages, he knew, had moments of tension but always recovered. And that's what he held on to. One Friday night, Thomas decided to plan something special. He prepared Laura's favorite dish, bought good wine, and set the dining table carefully. Soft music filled the atmosphere, and he imagined how the night would be a chance for rapprochement. However, as the hours dragged on, it became clear that Laura would not be coming for dinner. The food went cold, the wine remained untouched, and the empty chair in front of him was a stark reminder that something was different. He tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. When she finally arrived, it was already past midnight. Laura hurriedly entered the house, her clothes slightly disarranged, and avoided Thomas's gaze. She mumbled something about an event that had lasted longer than expected, but her explanation was vague, almost automatic. He observed her gestures, her restless hands, the way she took off her shoes and went straight up to her room without even asking about the night he had prepared. It was that night that something inside Thomas began to change. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask where she had been, nor did he ask for explanations. But, lying in bed next to her, he felt the physical distance between them as if it were an insurmountable chasm. Laura was no longer the same woman with whom he had shared his lifelong dreams and plans. And he began to realize that perhaps, no matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to restore what had been broken. The following week, Thomas made a decision. He was not a naturally suspicious man, but circumstances were taking him places he never imagined he would go. One afternoon, without Laura knowing, he decided to follow her. It was something he hated doing, but the feeling that she was hiding something from him gnawed at him inside. I needed answers, no matter how painful they were. Laura left home in the afternoon, with the excuse that she was meeting a friend to discuss an art project. Thomas watched from afar as she got into her car and drove through the city, until she stopped in front of a modern apartment building, a place he didn't recognize. He parked at a distance and saw her get out of the car, without looking around, and enter the building. He waited. Time seemed to drag by, every minute was torture. The building was silent, with no sign of movement. Thomas felt his heart racing, his hands sweating as he waited. Something inside him told him that this wait would reveal a truth he wasn't ready to face. After an hour, she left. But I wasn't alone. A man accompanied her, and they walked together with an intimacy that Thomas had never seen between Laura and anyone else. She laughed at something the man said, and he touched her lightly on the arm, a casual gesture but full of meaning. Thomas's body froze. He felt as if the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. There, in front of him, was the confirmation he feared so much. Laura was involved with another man. They said goodbye with a brief kiss, and Laura returned to the car. When she drove back home, Thomas didn't follow her. He stood there, his heart heavy, watching the man disappear into the building, as if his presence was a final blow to everything he had believed about his marriage. The ride home that night was a blur. Thomas drove through the streets without really seeing what was in front of him. The emptiness he felt was devastating. When he arrived, the house was silent. Laura was already in the shower, and he knew that when she got out, she would lie down next to him as if nothing had happened. As if she were still his faithful wife. But he knew. Now, he knew the truth. She went downstairs, already dressed in a light nightgown, her hair still damp. When she saw him in the living room, sitting on the sofa, she forced a smile and asked how his day had been. He looked at her for a long moment, feeling anger mix with a sadness so deep he could barely breathe. She sat next to him, as if everything was normal, as if that betrayal was still hidden beneath the surface of her calm words. He couldn't face it. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, so many screams he wanted to let out, but in that moment, he could only feel the crushing weight of betrayal. The air between them was thick with tension, and yet Laura seemed oblivious, ignoring the fact that her mask was beginning to slip. Thomas got up, without saying anything, and went to his room. He knew there was no point in confronting her there, at that moment. I needed time, I needed to plan what came next. But the certainty that his marriage was ruined hit him with every step he took. The betrayal was there, naked, explicit. What was left now was to decide what to do with it. That night, lying in bed next to a woman who now seemed like a complete stranger to him, Thomas couldn't sleep. He was silent, listening to Laura breathing beside him, and his mind was lost in all the possibilities. The pain of betrayal was mixed with the need for revenge. How could she do this to him? How could she destroy something so precious, something he had fought to keep for so many years? Dawn was advancing, and Thomas knew that the calm wouldn't last for long. The silence that had dominated Thomas's days turned into a deafening noise inside his mind. He spent the hours following the discovery of the betrayal in a state of constant alert, as if every detail of his life now needed a closer look, a more critical assessment. His time with Laura seemed like a farce, every word exchanged carried the weight of disloyalty, and he could barely hide the repulsion he felt. But he knew it wasn't the time yet. I couldn't confront her until I was completely prepared. I needed control. That week, Thomas visited his lawyer. It was a practical matter. He knew the marriage was doomed, but he didn't want Laura to know yet. They had joint assets, accounts, investments, a home built on what he thought was love and trust. Now, it was all at stake. And he wasn't willing to hand everything over on a plate to a woman who betrayed him in the shadows. As soon as he left the lawyer's office, with all the instructions for the next step, he began to devise his plan. The following days were coldly calculated. Thomas continued to smile when necessary, prepare dinner mechanically, and even agree with Laura's plans for the future, plans that he knew would never come to fruition. She mentioned trips, renovations, projects that included the two of them as a couple, as if the betrayal hadn't occurred, as if he were still the same man who blindly trusted her. But inside, Thomas was consumed with silent rage. He was waiting for the right moment to act. Finally, on a Friday night, the opportunity arrived. Laura had mentioned that she would be going out again, to meet friends, and discuss the latest exhibition she was working on. She no longer made an effort to hide it. Thomas knew exactly where she was going. He had confirmed her relationship with the other man in a series of discreet investigations. I knew his name, I knew where he lived, and most importantly, I knew the kind of life Laura wanted with this man. A comfortable life, supported by what she believed was a guaranteed achievement. Thomas remained at home, awaiting Laura's return, as he always did. She returned late, almost at dawn, with the same evasive behavior as on other nights. But there was something different that night. There was a coldness in her gaze that he couldn't ignore. She went upstairs without saying anything, heading straight to her room. Thomas followed, his every step echoing the tension built up over the past few weeks. His head was filled with dark thoughts, but his face remained impassive, like a poker player waiting for the last card. In the room, the atmosphere was dense. Laura approached the mirror, slowly taking off her jewelry and placing it on the dresser. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching her every move, analyzing the gestures that were once so familiar, but now seemed to belong to a completely strange person. He knew he could no longer prolong that theater. "Laura, we need to talk," he said, his voice firm but calm. She turned, surprised but not worried. It was as if he had been waiting for this, as if he had somehow known the confrontation would happen at some point. "About what?" she asked, adopting a casual tone, perhaps believing she could control the situation like she did with her usual lies. "About us. About all this you've been hiding." Thomas took a step towards her, his eyes fixed on hers, searching for any sign of remorse, of regret. But what he found was an almost disdainful expression. She sighed, as if she were tired of maintaining that facade. "Thomas, please don't start with that. I'm exhausted." "Exhausted?" he repeated in disbelief. "Are you exhausted from living this lie? Or exhausted from trying to keep up appearances while running into another man's arms?" Silence fell over the room like a bomb. Laura froze, her eyes widening for a brief moment, before she quickly regained her composure. "What are you talking about? What are you accusing me of?" Thomas laughed, a bitter laugh, full of contempt. He knew she would try to deny it, it was predictable. But now, he was no longer willing to play that game. He approached the bed, picked up the cell phone he had left on the bedside table and calmly displayed the photos he had taken. Photos of Laura leaving her lover's building. Photos of the two of them together, laughing, touching, an intimacy that should only belong to the two of them, but was now shared with someone else. "Do you really think I'm stupid, Laura?" The words came out of him with a weight that Laura hadn't expected. She looked at the photos, unable to deny what was right before her eyes. She didn't need to pretend anymore. The mask fell, and all that was left was the naked truth. The betrayal was exposed. For a moment, Laura remained silent, as if considering what she would say next. But then, a defiant expression came over his face. "And what are you going to do now, Thomas? Are you going to kick me out of the house? Are you going to scream? Throw everything up?" Thomas didn't respond right away. He took a deep breath, controlling the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to take over his actions. There was anger, yes. But more than that, there was a cruel clarity about what he needed to do. "I just wanted to know how long you thought you could keep up this charade," he said finally. "How long did you think I would stay blind while you lived another life, while you," he trailed off, his voice trailing off for a second. "While you cheated on me." Laura crossed her arms, as if preparing for battle. "Thomas, things change. We change. And maybe you should have realized that before everything got to this point." "Get to that point?" Thomas repeated in disbelief. "Are you trying to justify this? Are you trying to blame me for something you did?" Laura shook her head, as if tired of explaining something that was already obvious to her. "I just want to say that maybe the problem isn't just cheating. Maybe the problem is that we are no longer the same." Thomas felt his blood boil. "You're right. We are no longer the same. Because the woman I thought I knew, the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, simply doesn't exist anymore." "Thomas, we were living in an illusion," Laura replied, her voice firmer now. "We were convenient for each other. But convenience is not enough. Sure, you were fine with that convenience while I supported everything here," he snapped, anger finally boiling over. "And that's what you really like, isn't it? Of the life we built together. From the security I offer while you do what you want." It was then that silence took over the room again. But this time, he was darker, more definitive. Laura didn't respond immediately, and Thomas noticed something in her gaze. Something she was still hiding, something bigger than betrayal. He felt there was more to the story, something she hadn't revealed yet. Thomas took another step towards him. "What else are you hiding, Laura?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a brief second. And it was at that moment that he knew the real impact was yet to come. Thomas watched the silence take over the room, but, unlike other times, it wasn't a silence of doubt. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating truth, the kind that precedes the final fall. Laura, who until then had maintained a defensive posture, now seemed to hesitate. His eyes avoided Thomas's, as if the weight of what was to come was too difficult to bear. "Laura," Thomas began again, his voice low but firm, "what else are you hiding?" She looked at him, and for an instant he saw something different. It wasn't anger, nor defiance, but a mixture of guilt and fear. It was at that moment that Thomas understood that, no matter how prepared he was to deal with the betrayal, what was to come would be much more difficult. "There's no point in hiding anything anymore," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. His body, tense until then, felt tired, as if he was finally ready to hear what needed to be said. "I already know about the betrayal. I know everything. Just tell me, what else is there?" Laura took a deep breath, crossing her arms as if trying to protect herself from what was about to come out of her mouth. There was a tremor in her voice when she finally spoke. "Thomas. I never wanted things to come to this," she began, her voice shaky but at the same time controlled. "I know what I did is unforgivable. I betrayed you. I betrayed our marriage, our history." She stopped, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. But it wasn't just that. Thomas felt his body stiffen again. There was a bigger secret. He already knew this, but hearing Laura admit it was like a knife being slowly stabbed into his chest. "So what was it?" he asked, feeling impatience rising within him. "What else could you do other than cheat on me with another man?" Laura closed her eyes for a brief moment, struggling to find the right words. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I took everything from you, Thomas." He frowned, not immediately understanding. "What do you mean by that?" She swallowed hard, the tension on her face growing. While I was with him, we talked about what would become of the two of us. And I thought that if I left you, I would have nothing. Nothing we built, no security." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Her every word seemed to tear at the fabric of his trust, revealing a new layer of betrayal. He knew she was hiding something big, but what was coming was worse than he could have imagined. "So I made sure everything was in my name," she continued, her voice weak, barely audible. "The bills, the investments, even the house. I transferred everything into my name while you trusted me." Thomas was silent for a long moment. He looked at Laura, trying to process what he had just heard. The physical betrayal that had already devastated him now seemed minor compared to what she had done. She had not just betrayed her heart, but her entire life. Everything he believed he had built, the financial security he thought he had, was now in her hands. He had blindly trusted Laura while she, behind his back, undermined each of his pillars of support. He felt a wave of anger rise within him, but it was a contained, cold, almost calculated anger. "You stole from me," he said slowly, each word filled with a mixture of incredulity and contempt. Laura shook her head, as if she wanted to deny the truth, but there was no turning back. "I thought it would be best for us. I thought, if things fell apart, I would need a way out. I thought you would understand." "Would you understand?" Thomas repeated, his voice rising in pitch. "You destroyed everything, Laura. There is nothing left to understand." She took a step back, as if the impact of Thomas's words had hit her physically. But still, there was no regret in her eyes. There was only a cold fear, a fear of losing the control she had thought she had. "Thomas, I know this is unforgivable, but," she tried to continue, but he interrupted her. "Unforgivable?" He stood up suddenly, fury finally taking over his posture. "Do you think that word even begins to cover what you did? You didn't just cheat on me, you didn't just go to bed with another man. You stole from me. You took everything from me while I was here, trusting you." Laura bit her lip, her facade beginning to crack. I didn't know what else to do. I needed to make sure that if I wanted to leave, I had something." Thomas laughed, but it was a bitter, joyless, lifeless laugh. "And that was your plan all along, wasn't it? Take everything from me and run away with him? Leave me with nothing while you live a comfortable life with your lover?" She didn't respond. Her silence was confirmation he didn't need to hear in words. Thomas felt the weight of the revelation crushing him completely. Everything he had believed he was protecting, all the silent actions he had taken over the past few days, now seemed futile. She already had everything. While he was plotting his revenge, Laura had already played the last blow, ensuring that there was nothing left for him to recover. Thomas's world was falling apart. He thought about the nights he spent trying to save his marriage, the hours dedicated to maintaining his routine, believing that things would go back to normal. All this, while Laura undermined every part of her life. It was like watching your house crumble before your eyes, brick by brick, without being able to do anything. How could you? The question left his lips almost without him noticing. It was no longer a practical issue, but an emotional one. He needed to understand what had brought her to this point. He needed to know why the woman he had shared a life with was willing to destroy him in this way. Laura lowered her head, and for the first time that night, Thomas saw a tear run down her face. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't be. There were no excuses that could erase what she had done. Thomas, she began, her voice broken. I don't know. I just got lost. It lost? He shook his head in disbelief. Did you get lost? You destroyed our entire life. And now you tell me it was because you got lost? She lifted her head finally, her eyes red with barely contained tears. I can't change what I did. I can't go back. But I never wanted it to be like this. Thomas took a step back, feeling suffocated by her proximity. But it was like that, Laura. And now, I have nothing left. Silence fell again in the room. Laura stood there, unable to respond, while Thomas absorbed the full weight of the betrayal. Everything was over. Thomas pulled away from Laura, feeling the weight of the air around him becoming almost unbearable. The walls of his room, which had once represented the safe place he and his wife had built together, now seemed to enclose him in an emotional prison. His steps, which took him to the bedroom door, were slow, heavy, as if each movement required superhuman effort. Everything inside him wanted to scream, destroy, fight back with the same intensity as the pain he was feeling. But instead, he just left, leaving Laura alone, with her tears and her lies. He walked down the stairs slowly, and the house, silent at that hour, seemed to offer him the time he needed to process everything. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the walls, everything there was a reminder of a life he believed to be real, a life that now seemed like a simulacrum, an illusion built on empty promises. Thomas's mind was spinning. He wanted to believe that there was still some hope, some way to regain what was left of his dignity, but the truth was that he didn't know how to act from there. Upon arriving in the living room, he looked at the sofa where they had sat together so many times, talked, laughed. Good and bad memories mixed together, and now everything seemed stained by that revelation. Silence continued to hover, as he tried to find a foothold for what he would do next. But the dilemma that faced Thomas was greater than he imagined. He had two choices: follow the path of revenge or try to seek some form of justice that wouldn't completely destroy him in the process. Thomas's gaze wandered around the house once more. His heart, once full of certainties, was now full of doubts. The rage that consumed him threatened to turn him into something he didn't want to be. He knew there was a fine line between demanding justice and completely losing oneself in hatred. Deep down, as much as Laura deserved to pay for her actions, he knew that if he gave in to bitterness, he would end up destroying himself. It was then that he heard soft footsteps coming down the stairs. Laura. She came after him, without saying a word at first. When he finally approached, his presence was like a shadow, almost imperceptible, but filled with tension. Thomas didn't look at her. I couldn't. The sight of her sickened him, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't escape the situation forever. Thomas. She said, her voice low, broken. I know there are no excuses for what I did. I know you must hate me now. He remained silent, staring at the ground in front of him. Hate was a strong word, but the truth was that he could no longer look at Laura in the same way. The love he once felt for her was buried beneath an avalanche of hurt, but there was something more complicated there, something he couldn't name. She continued, hesitantly, I wanted you to know that, despite everything, a part of me, still cares. Still, feels something for you. Thomas laughed, but it was a hollow, lifeless laugh. Do you have feelings for me? He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that Laura couldn't sustain for long. You destroyed everything, Laura. You took everything from me. And now you want to talk about how you feel. She bit her lip, clearly trying to control the tears that threatened to escape. I don't know what I was thinking. I lost myself, Thomas. But I never wanted to hurt you like that. I never wanted things to come this far. He shook his head slowly, without looking away. You got here because you wanted to, yes. Because, at some point, you chose what was most convenient for you. You made your choice, Laura. And now, you have to live with it. The weight of those words hung between them. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Thomas knew that what he said was the blunt truth, and there was no going back. Laura knew this too. But what came next? What was left after such a profound betrayal? He wondered what was left for him as a man, as a person. Everything he had known up until then seemed to be falling apart. I'm leaving, Laura said, breaking the silence. She sounded defeated, but there was something else in her voice. A touch of resignation, perhaps. I can't stay here, not after what I've done. Thomas looked at her, trying to understand what she really wanted with that statement. Was it true regret or just another attempt to escape? Are you leaving? He repeated, more to himself than to her. And where are you going, Laura? Are you going to his house? Are you going to live the life you thought would be better than the one we built here? She looked down, not having the courage to respond. Thomas knew there was no answer that could justify her actions, but he also knew that deep down, he had already lost Laura long before he discovered her betrayal. She was already gone, in a way, before he even realized it. He took a deep breath, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to explode inside him. Part of him wanted her to leave, for her to disappear from his life so he could somehow rebuild what was left. But another part, darker and less rational, wanted revenge. I wanted her to pay for everything she did, one way or another. I can't stop you from going, he said finally. And maybe it's better this way. Maybe I need my own space, away from you. She nodded, still not looking directly at him. I hope that one day you can forgive me. Not for what I did, but, for the person I've become. Thomas was silent, unable to respond. Forgiveness seemed like a distant word, almost impossible at that moment. But he knew that carrying hatred for the rest of his life would destroy him as much as betrayal. Laura took a step toward the door, and for a brief moment, he felt a pang of nostalgia, a vague memory of the love they once shared. But soon reality set in again, and the pain returned with full force. She stopped before leaving, turning one last time to him. Goodbye, Thomas, she said, her voice breaking. He didn't respond, and the sound of the door closing behind her echoed through the house. Thomas stood there, still, staring into space. Laura's departure brought no relief, no closure. It just left a deep silence, a void impossible to fill. The moral dilemma before him now was how to move on with what was left of his life. How to rebuild yourself after being broken in so many ways. The road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt that, despite everything, there was a choice to be made. And he would need to decide whether he would be the eternal victim of betrayal or whether he would find the strength to rebuild something new, even if different. The house was silent. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt like the chaos had eased. The sound of the door closing behind Laura had echoed for what seemed like an eternity, but now, the silence was no longer a prison. It was a relief, a necessary calm after the storm. He looked around the room, seeing the same furniture, the same walls, but something had changed. Laura's absence filled the atmosphere in an almost palpable way, and for the first time, Thomas took a deep breath, trying to reconnect with himself, away from the lies and betrayal that had destroyed him. He knew he would still have to deal with the legal consequences of everything Laura had done. The house, the assets, the bills, everything was still under her control, but now he had a decision to make: fight for every penny or leave it behind. He felt emotionally drained, but at the same time, there was a spark of something new inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to start over, to rebuild a life he had lost so long ago without realizing it. The next day, Thomas got up early, as he always did. The weight of the night before was still on his shoulders, but there was a new determination in his chest. He dressed slowly and, for the first time in weeks, decided not to let his anger or sadness take over. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. Over the next few weeks, he contacted his lawyers, reviewed financial documents, and, with surprising calm, accepted the losses Laura had caused. The damage was already done. She had deceived him, taken what he had, and nothing he did would change that. However, Thomas understood that revenge, although tempting, would not bring him peace. He let the divorce process run its course, giving up many material possessions that, in the end, meant nothing close to the emotional freedom he was seeking. Laura, on the other hand, took a different path. As soon as she left the house that night, she tried to immerse herself in the comfort of her relationship with her lover, believing that her new life would be easier, more fulfilling. However, the man with whom she had bet all her chips was not willing to share the burden of her decisions. He didn't want the drama of a messy divorce, nor the responsibility of caring for Laura now that her life was in pieces. It was then that she realized that by betraying Thomas and taking everything from him, she had also taken everything from herself. She found herself alone, without the support she thought was guaranteed, and the relationship she had so idealized with her lover began to fall apart. He, after all, didn't want commitment, just the adventure. Laura, who had engineered her own downfall, was now adrift, without a husband, without a lover, and without the stable life she once had with Thomas. Months passed, and the divorce was finally finalized. Thomas accepted the loss of his house and most of his possessions, but he wasn't worried about it. He had rediscovered something much more valuable, his own strength. He moved to a smaller but cozy apartment and began to slowly rebuild his life. He took up old hobbies that he had put aside, such as photography and morning runs. Little by little, Laura's shadow was left behind, and he allowed himself to think about the future without the pain that previously consumed him. Laura, on the other hand, saw her life fall apart irrevocably. The friends she had tried to keep over time began to move away, learning of the cheating and divorce scandal. Her artistic career, which had never taken off as she had dreamed, began to fade as the doors to new opportunities closed. Alone and without support, she had to face the fact that she had destroyed everything she had for something that, in the end, wasn't worth it. Thomas, in turn, found something unexpected. On one of his morning runs, he came across a woman who used to frequent the same park. She was discreet, calm, and there was a simplicity in her smile that caught his attention. They started chatting casually, and what started as casual encounters soon turned into something deeper. She was different from Laura in many ways, but there was something about her that Thomas couldn't ignore, a genuine honesty, a lightness he hadn't felt in years. Without rushing, he allowed himself to get to know this new person, without the scars of the past dictating his every move. For the first time, he felt free to live something new, something that wasn't tainted by the lies and betrayals that had defined his marriage to Laura. Laura, on the other hand, was plunged into a void that seemed to have no end. She realized, too late, that the choices she made destroyed more than her marriage to Thomas. They destroyed themselves. Without Thomas to support her, emotionally and financially, she had to deal with the consequences of her decisions. The life she had planned with her lover never happened, and now, alone, she lived with the weight of her own destruction. What was left for Laura was regret, a silent pain that accompanied her every day. She had bet everything and lost. And now, looking back at everything she had destroyed, she realized that the decisions she had made had led her down a path of no return. Thomas, on the other hand, found a kind of peace. He knew he would never forget what happened, but he also knew he didn't have to carry this pain forever. He had the opportunity to start over, to rebuild, and, little by little, he did exactly that. The man who had once been destroyed by betrayal was now stronger, wiser. He had learned that sometimes the greatest revenge is not hate, but the simple act of moving on and living well. And so, while Laura continued to deal with the shadows of her choices, Thomas moved forward, finding a new path, free from the pain and past that almost destroyed him. So, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments, we really want to know what you thought of the outcome. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we always bring impactful and emotional dramas. Remember, the channel does not support any type of cheating. Cheating destroys lives, relationships and, often, those who cheat end up destroying themselves too. Until next time.